Close your eyes now and let your breathing find its own slow rhythm, like the quiet turning of a millstone under starlight. Feel the cool night air settle over your skin, the faint, almost imagined scent of warm grain and wood smoke drifting in from somewhere far away. Tonight, we are not in a hurry. There is no need to hold on to any detail, no need to remember a single date or name. This is simply the long, gentle story of bread, told the way someone might speak to you in the small hours when the house is quiet, the lights are low, and the world has stepped back just far enough to let you rest. If the sound of a calm voice helps the edges of the day soften, stay here as long as you like. Let the words move past you like smoke rising from a distant hearth. And if sleep arrives before the end, that is exactly as it should be. Let us begin where it always begins, with the land itself. Picture a wide, open place beneath a pale sky. The air is dry, but not cruel. The ground is firm under bare feet, warm from the sun, yet it still holds a little morning dampness in the shade of low scrub. This is the Fertile Crescent, a gentle arc of soil stretching from the slow green ribbon of the Nile, through the twin rivers of Mesopotamia, and up into the sun-baked hills of Anatolia. Around 12,000 years ago, people began to notice certain wild grasses. Their seed heads were small, bearded, easily scattered by wind. Einkorn wheat carried 1 grain per spike. Emmer wheat carried 2. Both were stubborn plants. They didn't need rich, black soil or constant rain. They liked places where winters were cold enough to kill pests, and summers warm enough to swell the grain, where the land was open enough to let sunlight reach every stalk. Stand there for a moment. Feel the dry wind move across your forearms, carrying the clean, slightly sweet smell of ripening grass. Hear the soft hiss of seed heads brushing together. Taste the faint dust on your lips. This was not paradise. It was simply reliable. And reliability, in a world that could turn dry or cold without warning, was everything. Geography drew the lines. On the flat river plains, where silt from yearly floods renewed the soil, families could harvest enough to feed themselves and still have seed for next spring. In the higher, drier hills, people learned to select the toughest plants, the ones whose roots went deepest, whose heads didn't bow too easily under drought. Over generations, those choices shaped the grain, and the grain shaped the people. They learned to gather it in baskets woven from river reeds, to thresh it by beating the stalks against stones, to winnow it by tossing it into the wind so the chaff blew away like pale smoke. And they learned to store it in tall clay jars buried beneath the packed earth floor, in woven bins raised on stilts to keep out mice and damp. Grain keeps. That was the quiet revolution. Unlike fresh meat or soft fruit, it waited. A family that could store grain could survive a bad season. A village that could store grain could grow into something larger. So the land that gave bread its first breath was never loud or showy. It was steady. It asked only for patience. And in return, it gave the promise that tomorrow could be fed. Once the grain was gathered, the real labor began. Slow, repetitive, necessary. The first flour came from 2 stones, a larger base stone, flat or shallowly hollowed by generations of use, and a smaller handstone, heavy, smooth, fitting the curve of a palm. Grain was poured onto the base in a thin layer. The handstone moved in slow, patient circles. Stone grinding stone, seed cracking under pressure. The sound was low, constant, almost hypnotic. A soft, rasping crunch that filled the morning and returned in the evening. Feel the weight of the handstone in your own palm. Cool at first, then warming from friction. Smell the dry, clean scent of crushed grain rising up. A little sweet, a little earthy. Taste the faint grit that inevitably settles on your tongue. Hear the subtle shift as the grain gives way, from hard kernels to fine powder. The rhythm of your arm echoing the rise and fall of breath. This work took hours. In many households, it was the first task after dawn, and one of the last before dark. A family might spend half the day just preparing enough flour for the next few meals. The stone growing warmer, the air thickening with the fine dust that coated skin and clothes like a second layer. The flour was coarse, flecked with bran, tiny fragments of husk still clinging. That texture made the bread dense, heavy, chewy. Flatbreads were easiest. Pressed thin, cooked quickly. Leavened loaves, with their open crumb and gentle rise, would have to wait many centuries for the right combination of knowledge, fuel, and patience. Geography shaped even this labor. In the dry plains of Mesopotamia and Egypt, grinding could happen outside under a reed shade, the breeze carrying away some of the dust, the sun warming the stones to speed the work. In the cooler, wetter hills of Europe, it moved indoors beside the hearth, where the warmth helped dry damp grain, and the faint smell of wood smoke mingled with the grain's earthiness. The quern itself was made from whatever stone the land offered. Basalt in the Levant, with its dark, unyielding smoothness. Sandstone in Britain, rougher but reliable, each one wearing a little smoother with every passing season. The surface eventually polished to a gentle sheen by the same slow circles that turned seed into sustenance. So the hand moved season after season, turning the gift of the field into something that could be eaten. There was no hurry. Bread was not a luxury. It was the quiet promise that tomorrow would come. Bread needs heat. And at first that heat was simple, almost casual. A flat stone beside the fire, or the embers themselves. Dough was pressed thin and laid directly on the hot surface. It cooked quickly, often in minutes, the outside crisping to a faint golden brown, the inside staying soft and slightly chewy. You could hear it, a soft hiss as moisture escaped, a quiet pop as air pockets formed. Smell the first hint of char, the warm, nutty aroma rising up. Feel the heat against your face as you turned it with a stick, or bare hands calloused from work. In many places that was enough. Flatbread travelled well, stored well, could be torn by hand at any moment. But in the towns and cities, where people lived closer together and fuel was more carefully managed, something new appeared. The oven. The earliest ovens were modest, little more than clay domes built against a wall or dug into the ground, the clay baked hard by the first fires lit within. A bundle of twigs or dried dung was kindled inside until the dome grew hot to the touch, the air inside shimmering with heat. Then the embers were raked out with a long wooden tool, leaving the glowing floor ready. Dough went in. The opening was sealed with a flat stone or damp cloth, and the bread baked in the trapped heat. The smell was deeper now, the yeast awakening in the warmth, the crust forming a seal that held in steam. The sound was silence, save for the faint crackle as the bread expanded. Geography influenced this too. In Egypt, where wood was scarce along the Nile's floodplains, ovens burned dried dung or reeds from the riverbanks, giving the bread a subtle, earthy note that lingered on the tongue. In Mesopotamia, where date palms grew thick along the Tigris and Euphrates, palm fronds and kernels provided steady, fragrant heat, the smoke infusing the crust with a hint of sweetness. In Europe, where forests were denser and darker, oak and beech logs burned longer, their smoke giving the bread a deeper colour and a whisper of forest resin that you could taste in every bite. Leavened bread, bread that rises, needed even more control. Wild yeast from the air, from old dough left to sour in a corner of the hut, or from the skins of fruit gathered in the fields had to be fed, kept warm, kept alive. That took skill and patience. Watching the dough bubble and swell, smelling the faint tang of fermentation, feeling the soft give when you pressed a finger into it. In the cities of Sumer and Egypt, professional bakers emerged, people whose entire lives were spent tending dough and fire, whose hands knew the difference between a dough that was ready and one that needed another hour by the warmth of the embers. Bread became more than food. It became a trade, a craft, a small daily miracle performed in the heat and quiet of the oven room. For most of history, bread was not special. It was ordinary. It was what filled the belly when nothing else was certain. In many places, it supplied more than half of daily calories. A Roman legionary carried hard bread, panis militaris, wrapped in his cloak on campaign. It was dry, dense, but it lasted weeks in the dust and heat of March. Its crust hard enough to bite through with teeth gritted against the grit. A medieval peasant broke rye loaves with hands rough from fieldwork, the bread's sour tang cutting through the fatigue of a long day, its heaviness sitting solid in the stomach, like a promise of sleep. An Egyptian worker was paid in bread and beer, the bread baked in vast state ovens that filled the air with the smell of yeast and smoke. The beer brewed from the same barley, both warm in the hand and welcome after hours bent over the fields. Bread was eaten at nearly every meal. It was torn into chunks and dipped in olive oil that tasted of sun-ripened fruit, or lentil stew thick with garlic and cumin. It was sopped in broth to soften it when teeth were worn or gums were sore, the liquid soaking in until the bread became part of the soup itself. It was crumbled into warm milk for children, the pieces softening to a porridge that carried the faint sweetness of the cow's pasture. It was carried in a cloth when someone left the house for the fields or the market, a simple bundle tied with string, its weight a reassurance against the uncertainty of the day. It was broken in friendship. offered to strangers with a nod and a shared silence, placed beside the dead as a final offering, its familiar shape a bridge between this world and whatever lay beyond. Bread varied by region because geography never allowed anything else. In the north, where rye grew better than wheat in the damp, heavy soil, loaves were dark, sour, heavy enough to fill the stomach for hours. Their crust thick and chewy, with a bite that echoed the cold wind outside. In the south, where wheat ripened under stronger sun on lighter, sandier ground, bread was lighter, whiter, sometimes enriched with olive oil that left a silky sheen on the fingers, or honey that carried the faint floral note of nearby wildflowers. In the mountains, where fuel was scarce and fires small, flatbreads cooked quickly over embers, or their edges charred and crisp, their interior soft with pockets of steam. In the river valleys, where wood and dung were plentiful, larger loaves baked slowly in clay ovens, their crust thick and crisp with a satisfying crack when broken, their crumb open enough to hold butter or soft cheese that melted slowly in the mouth. Bread was never merely food. It was the quiet centre around which the day turned. The first thing broken at dawn, with the taste of sleep still on the tongue. The last thing eaten before sleep, when the body was heavy and the mind already drifting. Bread changed slowly, very slowly. The same hand-ground flour, the same clay oven, the same slow rise of dough. These things lasted for thousands of years. Empires rose and fell, cities burned and were rebuilt on their ashes. But the daily act of making bread remained almost unchanged. In some places it did improve. Water-powered mills appeared in the Roman Empire, their wooden wheels turning with the steady rush of river current, grinding grain faster than any hand could, the air filled with the low hum of gears and the fresh scent of flour spilling from the stones. Windmills rose on the open plains of Europe, their sails creaking in the breeze, harnessing the same wind that bent the wheat stalks to produce finer, whiter flour. Cast iron ovens, forged in the heat of new foundries, held heat longer than clay, their doors clanging shut with a solid thump, baking loaves more evenly, and with a crust that cracked under the knife, like fresh wood. But the essentials stayed the same: grain, water, heat, time, and someone willing to wait, feeling the dough's give, smelling its readiness, tasting the first warm slice, to know if the day's work was good. And even in Bavaria, that corner of Europe where forests meet the Alps, where the air is crisp with pine and the soil heavy with clay, bread found its own steady form in rye. Picture those rolling Bavarian fields, green in summer but blanketed in snow through long winters, where rye took root in the cool, damp earth that wheat often found too harsh. The loaves here were dark as the forest floor, heavy with a sour tang from long, slow fermentation, a process that drew out the grain's natural sweetness, like the faint honey note in wildflowers scattered along the meadow edges. Hear the rhythmic thump of dough being kneaded on wooden tables in farmhouses, the smell of caraway seeds or fennel mingling with the earthy rye as it's shaped into rounds or long batards. Feel the weight of a fresh slice in your hand, dense and substantial. Its crust thick from baking in wood-fired ovens fueled by local beech or spruce. The smoke leaving a subtle, resinous whisper on the tongue. In Bavarian traditions, rye bread anchored festivals like Oktoberfest, where it was broken alongside pretzels, those knotted shapes born from the same dough, boiled briefly in lye water for that glossy, chewy skin, then baked to a deep brown with coarse salt crystals that crunched under teeth, or in quieter rituals, like the blessing of bread on St. Martin's Day, where loaves were shared in the chill of November, their warmth a small defiance against the coming winter. Rye in Bavaria was more than food. It was the land itself, stubborn and enduring, shaped by the same alpine winds and river valleys that carved the landscape. Even today, many traditional breads still carry the shape and spirit of those early loaves. The flatbread, baked on hot stones in the Middle East, thin, blistered, fragrant with sesame seeds toasted to a nutty brown, its edges curling slightly from the heat. The dense rye loaf of northern Europe, dark as earth, sour from long fermentation, heavy enough to anchor a meal against the cold outside, its crust yielding with a satisfying give under pressure. The slow-risen sourdough of San Francisco, tangy from the city's famous fog-fed yeast, its crumb open and airy like sea foam, its crust shattering with a sound that echoes in the quiet kitchen. They are not relics. They are proof that some things endure because they work, because they fit the hand, the mouth, the rhythm of a life lived close to the ground. And so bread has never stopped being made. Not in famine, when the flour was stretched with sawdust or acorns, and the loaves came out flat and bitter. Not in war, when ovens were built from rubble and grain was rationed, but still shared. Not in peace, when new machines made it faster, but the old ways lingered in villages and bakeries, where the air still smelled of yeast and warmth. It is still the quiet promise that tomorrow will come, a promise carried in every grain, every grind, every slow rise, beside a fire that someone, somewhere, still tends, as our gentle journey through the history of bread quiets. Picture a small loaf resting on a worn wooden board. Its crust is cracked from the heat, still warm enough that you can feel the ghost of the oven against your fingertips. Somewhere outside, the wind moves through grain fields that have stood in the same place for thousands of years. The fire has burned low now. The millstone has stopped turning for the night. You do not need to stay awake for the end of this story. The story continues tomorrow, in every kitchen, in every hand that breaks bread. Breathe slowly, in, out. Feel the centuries settle like flower dust in still air. The fire softens, the fields hush, the world quiets. No more words needed, just ambient now, carrying you deeper into sleep.